Let's begin here, because too many people mistake worth for effort. They believe if they give more, stay longer, or bend further, someone will finally notice. But the truth is sobering, unending giving often makes you invisible. A woman of value is not defined by how much she pours out, but by how clearly she knows when enough is enough. Her presence carries its own weight, even in silence. Her worth does not increase because others finally applaud. It already exists, steady and unshaken, waiting only for her to honor it. Carl Jung once observed that what we deny in ourselves often becomes our shadow. And one of the most painful shadows is the belief that we are only as valuable as the recognition we receive. This is where our reflection must begin. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, consider how often the world teaches the opposite lesson. Supervisors reward the loudest, not the most dedicated. Family members lean on you, then dismiss your choices. Friends reach out only when they need something. And yet the instinct is to respond by giving more, as if effort could buy love. This is the mask, the persona that says, if I keep smiling, if I stay useful, they will not leave me behind. But beneath the mask lives the shadow voice whispering, why do I feel unseen, even when I have given everything? Jung understood that this inner split between the helper we show the world and the exhausted self we hide erodes our dignity. When we chase recognition from those unwilling to give it, we become trapped in what he called a one-sided relationship. The more we offer, the less it is valued. The more we explain, the less it is heard. Like casting pearls before those who only see stones, the gesture loses its meaning. The deeper truth is this: worth is not a debate to be won. It is not earned by endless sacrifice. It is already present, anchored in the self, the part of you that exists beyond approval or neglect. Individuation begins the moment you stop confusing generosity with desperation. It begins when you recognize that withholding is not cruelty, but balance and absence can speak louder than constant presence. In this series, we will explore what it means to step out of that shadow, to learn how boundaries protect energy, how absence reveals value, and how letting go of certain ties creates space for dignity to return. But for now, remember this simple beginning. You are not defined by who fails to see you. You are defined by how faithfully you honor the truth of your own worth. There comes a moment when the rhythm of overgiving begins to falter. At first, it seems harmless. A missed thank you, a forgotten acknowledgement, a promise set aside. You tell yourself it is small, that it means nothing. Yet, like a hairline crack in glass, it begins to spread in silence. And in that spreading fracture, the truth reveals itself. No matter how much you pour in, the return is less and less. The human heart notices these imbalances long before the mind admits them. You feel it in the heaviness after a day of giving more than you had. You feel it in the hollowness when kindness is met with silence, or when effort is quietly taken as expected. This is the first signal, the first break in the illusion that effort alone will earn appreciation. Jung saw this fracture as the point where the persona, the face we show the world, begins to wear thin. the mask of cheerfulness and endless patience starts to crack. Beneath it lies the shadow whispering resentment, fatigue, even quiet despair. This shadow is not an enemy, but a messenger. It says something is unbalanced. You are giving in order to be seen, but instead, you are disappearing. Consider how many live trapped in this rhythm. The more they are ignored, the more they try to prove themselves. The less they are thanked, the harder they work to become indispensable. A boss overlooks them, so they stay later at the office. A partner grows careless, so they double their efforts at home. A family member criticizes, so they bend even further to avoid conflict. Each time, the fracture grows deeper until the mask can no longer hold. Here lies the paradox. Abundance without recognition is not read as generosity, but as desperation. The more you give without receiving, the more others unconsciously devalue what you offer. Jung understood that without reciprocity, energy turns against itself. What was once an act of love or service becomes a silent bargain, a trade of dignity for scraps of recognition, and that trade can never be won. This is why the fracture matters. It is the first warning that the path you are on leads away from individuation and toward depletion. Individuation. The journey toward wholeness requires balance between giving and receiving, between self and other. When the balance breaks, when you give far more than you receive, your inner self begins to starve. You may notice how the fracture shows itself in subtle ways. You start keeping mental accounts measuring how much you have done compared to how little was returned. You begin rehearsing conversations in your head, planning how to finally ask for appreciation. You dream of walking out of becoming invisible just to see if anyone would notice. These are not signs of weakness. They are the psyche's way of saying the fracture is real and it cannot be ignored. Imagine standing in a room with a single mirror. Each time you give without receiving the reflection fades a little. At first, your face is still clear, but as the imbalance grows, the mirror clouds until you can hardly recognize yourself. This is what happens when your worth depends on those unwilling to see it. The fracture in the glass becomes a fracture in your own image. Jung often spoke of projection, the way we see in others what we cannot yet face in ourselves. In this case, the projection runs deep. We project our longing for value onto those least willing to give it back. The hope is that by convincing them, we will finally convince ourselves. Yet the opposite happens. Their neglect becomes our proof that we are not enough. And the cycle deepens. The first fracture is painful because it brings clarity. It shows us that our strategy of overgiving has not worked and will not work. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth. The more we chase recognition, the further it runs. Here, the persona of tireless helper begins to collapse, and the shadow demands to be heard. But do not mistake this fracture for failure. In Jung's language, cracks are not endings. They are openings. They allow what was hidden to come to the surface. The shadow's whisper is not to shame you, but to guide you back to balance. It asks, why are you teaching others that your worth is negotiable? Why are you proving again and again what is already true? In relationships, the fracture often appears when silence replaces gratitude. You cook the meal, but no one notices. You stay late at work, but the credit is taken. You hold space for a friend's troubles, but when your own sorrow comes, no one calls. These are not accidents. They are patterns, and patterns reveal values. What is ignored once may be forgetfulness. What is ignored always is a sign of how you are seen. The first fracture is both external and internal. Outwardly, you see the lack of reciprocity. Inwardly, you feel the cost, the erosion of energy, the loss of joy. The danger is not only that others do not value you, but that slowly you begin to mirror them. You start to believe the lie that your worth is less than theirs. This is the true fracture, the break between your inner truth and the false reflection offered back to you. Yet every fracture points toward decision. Will you continue to pour yourself into a cup that never fills? Or will you pause and listen to the shadow's warning? Jung teaches that the unconscious speaks in symbols, and the fracture is one such symbol. It says the structure you built is no longer sound. A new foundation is needed. Notice, too, how the fracture changes your dreams. You may dream of being locked out of your own home, or of carrying water that always leaks through your hands. Such images carry meaning. The psyche is showing you how depletion feels. These dreams are not cruel. They are invitations to wake to reality. The first fracture does not demand dramatic action. It asks first for awareness. To admit I am giving more than I receive. To see my energy is being drained, not replenished. To feel I am beginning to vanish in my own life. This awareness alone is the seed of transformation. In time, the fracture widens until it cannot be denied. But in that breaking open lies possibility. It is the psyche's way of saying, you cannot continue on the old path. You must honor your worth by setting a new rhythm. Jung believed that suffering when faced honestly becomes a teacher. The fracture is that teacher. It asks for courage, not in the form of louder giving, but in the stillness of saying no more. So let this be the recognition of part 2. The fracture appears not to punish, but to awaken. It shows you the imbalance that has long been hidden. It invites you to step back to see the truth as it is not as you wish it to be. And in doing so, it prepares you for the deeper work ahead, the work of confronting the mask and the shadow, of choosing boundaries, and of walking toward individuation. Because the truth is this: the fracture marks the end of illusions, but also the beginning of freedom. The fracture opens, and suddenly the mask no longer holds as it once did. The persona, the polished face offered to the world, still smiles, still agrees, still gives. But beneath it, another voice rises. The shadow speaks not in polite words, but in feelings that cannot be hidden. Irritation, envy, bitterness, even a longing to withdraw. The two sides pull against each other, leaving a deep inner tension. This conflict is not a sign of failure. It is the human experience of being divided between the image we think will keep us safe and the neglected truth that demands to be seen. The persona says, stay useful, stay agreeable, and you will not be abandoned. The shadow whispers, you are exhausted, you are unseen, and you are slowly vanishing. Together, they create a storm inside one that can last for years if left unexamined. Consider how the persona operates. It presents the self as dependable, cheerful, and endlessly available. It is the mask of the helper, the reliable friend, the loyal employee, the patient partner. This mask wins approval, at least for a time. Yet it wins it by hiding the costs, fatigue, quiet resentment, and a loss of personal dignity. The persona is not false in itself. It is a necessary adaptation to social life. But when it becomes rigid, when it silences the authentic self, it transforms from a tool into a prison. The shadow, by contrast, carries everything the persona denies. Anger over being overlooked. Jealousy of those who demand and receive without effort. Fear of being replaceable. Longing to walk away without explanation. These emotions are often judged as shameful, but Jung saw them as vital. The shadow is the dark container of truths that the conscious self cannot yet accept. When ignored, it festers and leaks out in passive aggression, sarcasm, or sudden outbursts. When faced directly, it reveals what balance has been lost. This is why many feel haunted during this stage. They dream of mirrors where their reflection fades, or of rooms filled with voices that never answer back. They imagine doors they cannot open, or voices calling their name without recognition. These images are not random. They are the psyche's attempt to portray the battle between the persona's polished surface and the shadow's hidden truth. You may recognize this conflict in daily life. Outwardly, you continue to serve, to care, to contribute. Inwardly, you begin to count the times no one returned the favor. Outwardly, you smile when plans are changed without concern for your needs. Inwardly, you feel the slow burn of anger, a sign that your dignity is being eroded. Outwardly, you reassure yourself that it is noble to give without expecting return. Inwardly, a voice insists that true reciprocity is the foundation of love. This inner conflict cannot be solved by pushing the shadow away. To deny it only makes it stronger. Jung taught that the shadow grows more dangerous when it remains unconscious. The more you insist that you are never angry, never resentful, never tired, the more these energies shape your relationships from beneath the surface. The result is not peace, but a quiet war within yourself. The cost of ignoring the shadow is heavy. It shows up in sleepless nights, in sudden tears, in the sense that no matter how much you do, it is never enough. It appears in the subtle withdrawal of joy when tasks once given freely now feel like burdens. It surfaces in envy when you notice how easily others receive what you struggle to earn. These are signs that the shadow is asking not to be judged, but to be acknowledged. Facing the shadow requires honesty. It means admitting I am tired of being overlooked. I am hurt by the lack of reciprocity. I resent how much I give without return. These admissions are uncomfortable because they threaten the persona's image of patience and selflessness, but they are necessary. Without them, the fracture between outer mask and inner truth only widens. Some resist this stage by doubling down on the persona. They work harder, smile brighter, and give more, hoping that the mask will eventually bring the recognition they crave. But this only deepens the problem. Others swing to the opposite extreme, letting the shadow erupt, without reflection, burning bridges, lashing out, or retreating into bitterness. This too is incomplete, for it destroys connection without restoring dignity. The real path lies between, in conscious recognition of both persona and shadow. Here, Jung's insight becomes crucial. What you resist persists. If you resist the shadow, it will find its way into your life in destructive forms. But if you turn toward it with curiosity, it can become a guide. The anger reveals where your boundaries have been crossed. The envy points to what you secretly desire, but have not allowed yourself to claim. The exhaustion shows where you have carried too much for too long. In this way, the shadow becomes a map toward individuation. The clash between persona and shadow is not only psychological, it is spiritual. It raises the question of authenticity. Who are you when no one is watching? Who are you when you stop trying to earn love, recognition, or safety? The persona may keep peace with the outer world, but the self, the deeper center of the psyche, cannot be deceived. The self longs for wholeness, and it will not rest until both light and shadow are included. You can sense the cost of ignoring this call. Life becomes mechanical, drained of vitality. Relationships feel empty, even when they look full from the outside. Work feels endless, even when it appears successful. The fracture between persona and shadow becomes a chasm, leaving you split, lonely, and disconnected from your own essence. Yet this stage also carries great potential. The shadow, once acknowledged, releases energy. What was once tied up in resentment becomes fuel for change. What was once hidden becomes clarity. The persona, freed from the impossible task of keeping everything polished, can soften and become more flexible. Instead of being a rigid mask, it becomes a tool you can use when appropriate while remaining anchored in authenticity. The transition begins with small acts of honesty. Saying no to one demand instead of automatically agreeing. Admitting when you are tired instead of pretending you can carry more. Allowing yourself to feel disappointment without shaming yourself for it. Each act is a reconciliation between persona and shadow, a step toward wholeness. Jung described individuation as the process of bringing unconscious elements into consciousness, not to destroy them, but to integrate them. This stage is precisely that work. To bring forth the shadow, not as an enemy, but as a forgotten ally. To see that the anger, the resentment, and even the envy are signals pointing you back toward balance and dignity. To recognize that the mask alone cannot sustain you, but neither can raw shadow dominate your life. Integration means allowing both to have a place within the larger self. In this way, the conflict between persona and shadow is not the end, but the doorway. It is the portal through which greater authenticity becomes possible. Many resist walking through it, fearing that honesty will cost them relationships. But the greater cost is to remain divided within oneself forever, chasing recognition that never comes. So, the invitation of this stage is clear. Stop pretending the mask is enough. Stop condemning the shadow as unworthy. Instead, bring them into dialogue. Allow yourself to feel what you feel, to admit what has long been hidden, and to question the roles you have played. This is not selfishness. It is the beginning of self-respect. As the persona softens and the shadow is acknowledged, you may feel both fear and relief. Fear because change always threatens the old order. Relief because truth carries its own quiet strength. From here, a new possibility opens the awakening that comes when you realize that your worth is not dependent on others seeing it, but on you living it. This is the heart of Part 3, the battle between persona and shadow. It is not a war to be won, but a tension to be lived and integrated. Only by facing both sides honestly can you begin the deeper journey toward individuation. For in the end, it is not the mask that sets you free, nor the shadow alone, but the self that emerges when both are embraced. There comes a moment when the storm within begins to clear. The tension between persona and shadow has built to a breaking point, and suddenly, a new perception dawns. What once felt like a private war reveals itself as a lesson. The way forward is not to fight harder, but to shift perspective. Awakening often arrives not as thunder, but as a quiet recognition. A realization that nothing changes until you begin to change the way you hold your own worth. The awakening begins with a pause. You notice that the more you explain yourself, the less you are heard. The more you give, the less it is valued. The more you plead, the more invisible you become. In that pause, you see the pattern clearly, and clarity itself is transformative. It is as if the fog lifts and you recognize the truth you are feeding a cycle that was never designed to nourish you. Jung described this moment as the turning of the mirror. For years you have looked outward, hoping the reflection of others would show your value. But the mirror turns inward, and you glimpse something startling. Your worth was never missing. It was simply hidden behind the mask of persona and the cries of the neglected shadow. What you sought outside was waiting within whole and unbroken. This shift is not about blame, but about awakening responsibility. It is not your task to convince others to see what they refuse to see. It is your task to stop giving away your worth where it is not honored. To recognize that protecting your energy is not cruelty, but balance. That absence can speak more truth than endless explanation. And that silence, when chosen with dignity, is not weakness, but strength. Notice how this awakening reshapes the landscape of relationships. When you stop pouring effort into one-sided dynamics, space opens for reciprocity to emerge. Either the other person steps forward sensing the absence and recognizing what they have ignored, or they remain unchanged, revealing their true disinterest. Both outcomes bring freedom. One deepens the relationship with greater balance. The other clarifies that your worth was never meant to be proven there. In both cases, you reclaim dignity. The awakening also reveals the difference between standards and demands. Demands come from desperation, trying to force others into acknowledgement. Standards, however, are calm and steady. They are the lines you draw in the sand that say, "This is the measure of how I will be treated." Jung understood that individuation requires such standards, not as rigid rules for others, but as guiding principles for how you honor yourself. Standards transform the shadow's resentment into the self's clarity. You may find that the awakening comes with both grief and relief. Grief, because you see how long you have labored for recognition that never came. Relief because you realize you no longer need to chase it. The chains loosen the moment you stop confusing generosity with proof. In this space, your energy, once drained, begins to return. You feel lighter, clearer, more grounded in your own presence. Dreams often mirror this awakening, where before you dreamt of fading reflections and locked doors, now you dream of keys or open paths. Perhaps a house that once felt crowded with strangers becomes a place of quiet order. These symbols mark the psyche's recognition that balance is possible and that a new relationship with yourself is emerging. At its heart, the awakening is a reframe. Instead of asking, "Why don't they value me?" you begin to ask, "Why am I still offering where no value is given?" Instead of pleading for recognition, you redirect energy toward places where reciprocity is alive. Instead of shrinking behind the persona, you begin to step into the self. This is the turning point where individuation becomes more than theory. It becomes practice, embodied in daily choices. Think of how this reframe appears in ordinary life. The worker who once stayed late without acknowledgement now leaves on time, trusting that the value of her labor is not tied to invisible sacrifice. The friend who organized every gathering steps back, letting silence reveal who else truly wishes to connect. The partner who carried the weight of the household pauses, no longer confusing duty with dignity. Each of these small acts reflects the awakening worth is not earned by depletion, but revealed by balance. Jung warned that such awakenings can be unsettling because they strip away illusions. When you stop overgiving, you may discover who was only there for convenience. When you stop explaining, you may find who was never listening. When you step back, you may see who never intended to step forward. This truth is sobering, but it is also freeing. For illusions, however comforting, always drain more energy than reality. The awakening also reveals the sacred role of absence. When you are always available, your presence becomes invisible. When you step back with intention, others feel the space you once filled. This absence is not manipulation, but clarity. It allows the reality of your contributions to be seen in contrast. Jung called this learning through experience. Others learn your value not because you argue for it, but because they must live without it. And you learn just as deeply that your energy belongs where it is cherished. Silence, too, becomes a teacher. Where once you rush to explain now, you allow the quiet to stand. Silence holds dignity. It communicates what words cannot, that your worth does not depend on convincing anyone. In silence, you withdraw from the endless performance of the persona and return to the grounding presence of the self. You realize that sometimes the most powerful statement is to stop speaking into ears that do not hear. This awakening prepares the ground for transformation. It shows you that individuation is not about pleasing everyone or maintaining harmony at all costs. It is about balance between light and shadow self and other giving and receiving. When this balance is restored, relationships become clearer. Some grow stronger, built on reciprocity. Others fall away, no longer supported by your overgiving. Both are part of the natural order of individuation. The awakening does not mean you stop giving. Generosity remains a virtue, but it flows from a different source. It is no longer a desperate offering to prove your worth, but a natural expression of it. You give because you choose to, not because you fear rejection. You help because it nourishes both, not because it depletes you to keep the peace. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of balance, of aligning the outer act with the inner truth. As you live from this awareness, a subtle magnetism grows. You become more attractive to people who value reciprocity because your boundaries signal self-respect. You become less vulnerable to those who exploit because you no longer trade dignity for scraps of attention. This shift is not dramatic. It is steady, quiet, and deeply rooted. It is the awakening of the self in daily life. And so the awakening is both an ending and a beginning. It ends the illusion that worth can be earned through endless giving. It begins the journey of honoring that worth by setting standards, practicing silence, and allowing absence to reveal the truth. From here, the next step arises naturally to make choices and set boundaries that embody this awakening. Choices that transform the lesson into lived reality. Choices that mark the path toward freedom. For in the end, the awakening is not about others at all. It is about you seeing clearly what has always been true, that your worth is not conditional, that your energy is sacred, and that individuation, the journey toward wholeness, begins the moment you stop looking outward for proof and turn inward to honor what was never in doubt. Awakening alone is not enough. To glimpse the truth is powerful, but unless it is embodied in action, it fades like a dream at dawn. Real change begins when awareness becomes choice, and choice becomes boundary. This is the moment where the inner realization takes outer form, where the self steps forward to reshape the patterns that have long drained your strength. A boundary is not a wall, but a door. It does not imprison, it clarifies. It does not punish, it protects. In Jungian language, a boundary is the natural consequence of individuation. The recognition that the self must be honored, not sacrificed endlessly to appease the demands of others. Without boundaries, the persona rules, smiling even as it crumbles. With boundaries, the shadow is acknowledged and transformed into clarity. Setting boundaries begins with small but decisive acts. You turn the phone off after a certain hour, and your evenings become sacred again. You stop answering messages immediately, and suddenly the rhythm of reciprocity reveals itself. You decline the request that once would have been automatic, and in that single refusal, you reclaim dignity. Each act is simple, but the meaning is profound. They signal to yourself and to others, my worth is not for negotiation. The fear of boundaries often arises from the old belief that love and safety come from pleasing everyone. To say no feels like rejection. To step back feels like abandonment. Yet the deeper truth is the opposite. Without boundaries, connection decays into resentment. With boundaries, love becomes clearer, cleaner, and more sustainable. Jung wrote that what we fail to confront within ourselves, we project onto others. Boundaries interrupt this projection. They return responsibility to where it belongs, and they prevent you from carrying what was never yours to hold. This transformation can feel unsettling at first. Those accustomed to your endless giving may resist, accuse, or withdraw. But this too is a revelation. It shows who valued your presence only when it came at no cost to them. Boundaries become the great filter. They do not destroy relationships. They reveal their quality. The ones rooted in reciprocity adjust respect and grow stronger. The ones rooted in exploitation fade because without imbalance, they cannot survive. Boundaries are not only external, but internal. It is the boundary between your own impulses, the urge to overextend, and the wisdom to hold back. It is the decision to stop rehearsing explanations, to stop justifying your existence, to stop bargaining for recognition. Internal boundaries are the lines you draw within. I will not betray myself for approval. I will not silence my needs to preserve another's comfort. I will not trade my dignity for temporary peace. These inner commitments shape every outward action. Consider how transformation unfolds through consequences. A colleague who takes credit for your work meets a new response. You document your contributions. You present them clearly. You withdraw the silent labor that once made exploitation possible. A friend who cancels again and again discovers that plans no longer revolve around their convenience. A family member who criticizes relentlessly finds that visits become less frequent until respect is shown. These are not punishments. They are natural consequences. Jung called this education. Through reality, people learn not from endless words, but from the boundaries that make behavior visible. This stage also demands consistency. Boundaries spoken, but not enforced, collapse into noise. Boundaries tested, but abandoned, return you to the old cycle. The self grows stronger through repetition, through each steady act of alignment. At first, the new pattern feels fragile, but with time, it becomes second nature. You no longer ask, will they still value me if I stop overgiving? You begin to ask, do I still value myself if I continue to allow this imbalance? The axis shifts, and with it, power returns. The transformation is not merely defensive. Boundaries create space for new life. The energy once spent on chasing recognition becomes available for growth, creativity, and joy. You find yourself drawn to relationships that feel lighter, where appreciation flows naturally. You discover projects or practices that nourish you deeply, not because they impress others, but because they express your essence. This is the fertile ground that opens only after the soil has been cleared of weeds. Jung understood that individuation requires both death and rebirth, the death of patterns that no longer serve, and the rebirth of the authentic self. Boundaries mark the death of illusion, the illusion that others will change if you give enough, that silence equals safety, that love is earned by depletion. In their place comes rebirth, the courage to honor your truth, the freedom to walk away when necessary, the dignity of living from standards rather than desperation. Symbolically, this stage feels like crossing a threshold. Behind you lies the old room cluttered with masks, empty promises, and constant demands. Before you lies a new space, simple but open, where only what nourishes is allowed to remain. You stand at the doorway, and the choice is yours. Every boundary you set is a step across that threshold. There will be grief. Boundaries often bring endings. Certain relationships may diminish or dissolve. Certain roles may fall away. The persona mourns for it was built to keep harmony at all costs. But the self understands these losses are not the end of love, but the clearing of false ties. What remains is truer, steadier, and far more sustainable. Boundaries also teach you about reciprocity in real time. When you pull back, some will step forward. When you say no, some will listen more carefully. When you limit access, some will respect the new rhythm. These responses reveal who is capable of real connection. Boundaries act like light, illuminating the hidden dynamics of every bond. This transformation is not selfish. It is necessary. To continue without boundaries is to deplete your own life force, leaving little for yourself or for anyone else. To live with boundaries is to respect the self, which then allows love and generosity to flow freely where they belong. Jung knew that individuation was not about isolation, but about integration. The integration of shadow and light self, and other giving and receiving. Boundaries make that integration possible. Over time, you discover that boundaries are not only protective, but creative. They shape the contours of a life that reflects your values. They make possible the choice to invest in relationships where appreciation is alive. They create time and energy for the pursuits that bring joy and meaning. Without them, life is drained by what does not nourish. With them, life becomes fertile ground for the self to unfold. In this way, the act of boundary setting becomes a sacred practice. Each no you speak is a yes to your own wholeness. Each step back from exploitation is a step forward into dignity. Each choice to limit access is a choice to preserve energy for what truly matters. Transformation does not happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in these steady, repeated acts that gradually reshape the entire landscape of your life. So, this is the essence of Part 5. The awakening must be followed by action, and the action is the setting of boundaries. Not as punishment, not as rebellion, but as the natural expression of a self that has learned its worth. Through boundaries, individuation takes form. The mask softens, the shadow is integrated, and the self begins to live in freedom. The transformation is not complete, for there is still one more step, the closure and integration that comes when lessons are absorbed into lasting wisdom. But already the path is clear. To choose is to honor yourself. To set boundaries is to protect your soul. And to live from this truth is to finally taste the freedom that was waiting all along. The journey we have followed through fracture, conflict, awakening, and boundary leads us here to integration. After the storm has passed, the question is no longer how to prove value, but how to live from it. The final step is not dramatic. It is quiet, steady, and deeply human. It is the choice to honor your worth as a daily rhythm, not an occasional insight. At this stage, the patterns of overgiving and pleading for recognition have been seen for what they are: survival strategies that no longer serve. The persona has softened, the shadow has spoken, and the self has stepped forward. Now the task is to weave this awareness into life so that the lessons do not fade but become part of who you are. This integration begins with acceptance. You recognize that some people will never value you no matter how much you offer. You stop clinging to the hope that more effort will change them. Instead, you accept the truth of their limits. This is not bitterness, it is wisdom. By letting go of the illusion, you protect your energy for relationships and pursuits that bring genuine reciprocity. Jung understood that individuation does not mean erasing hardship. It means transforming hardship into clarity. When you accept that certain ties cannot support your dignity, you no longer waste yourself in endless struggle. You release what drains, and in doing so, you make space for what nourishes. This release is not easy. It may come with grief, with memories of what could have been. But grief itself becomes cleansing, clearing away what was never real. What remains is a quieter strength. You discover that self-worth is not fragile, not dependent on the shifting moods of others. It is rooted in the self, that deeper center which cannot be erased by neglect or scorn. From this root, new life grows. You feel more grounded, less shaken by rejection, more selective in where you invest your energy. What once felt like desperation now feels like choice. This closure is also marked by peace with silence. You no longer need to defend your value with endless words. You no longer chase recognition with frantic explanations. Instead, you rest in the stillness that says, I am enough as I am. Silence, once a wound, becomes a sanctuary. It reflects a dignity that does not require applause. Relationships change as this peace takes hold. Some fade away, revealed as shallow when reciprocity was removed. Others deepen renewed by the strength of clearer standards. And new connections arise, drawn to the quiet magnetism of a person who knows their worth. The self does not cling, it attracts. It does not beg, it invites. It does not fear absence, it trusts that what belongs will remain. This is the final lesson. Your worth is not proved by constant effort. It is revealed in how you honor it. Each choice to step back from exploitation, each boundary spoken with calm clarity, each act of redirecting energy toward reciprocity. These are the ways worth becomes visible. You no longer chase mirrors that refuse to reflect you. You become your own mirror, steady and whole. Symbolically, this stage is like walking into a room filled with light after years in shadow. The walls are not decorated with praise or trophies. The light itself is enough. It reveals your presence without distortion. You no longer need the reflection of others to confirm that you exist. You know it by the steadiness of your own being. Jung would remind us that individuation is not a single event, but a lifelong path. The work of honoring your worth will return in new forms with new challenges. But once you have faced the fracture, listened to the shadow awaken to balance, and chosen boundaries, you cannot go back to the old blindness. You carry the memory of clarity, and it becomes your compass. So let us close with this truth. People who cannot see your value are not your judges. They are simply mirrors turned away. To waste yourself on them is to live in distortion. To honor yourself is to return to reality. Your worth is not fragile, not conditional, not up for debate. It is the ground beneath your feet. It is the light that remains, even when others close their eyes. And so the invitation now is simple. Live from this ground. Protect this light. Give where reciprocity flows. Withdraw where dignity is denied. Rest in silence when words would only scatter your strength. In these choices, your individuation continues. In these choices, you embody the freedom that comes when the self leads. As we conclude, I ask you to pause for a moment and reflect. Which part of this journey spoke most deeply to you? Was it the fracture, the awakening, the boundary, or the final release? Share your reflection in the comments below. Your words may help another listener recognize their own worth. And if this series has offered clarity or comfort, I invite you to stay with us. More reflections will follow each one, returning to Jung's timeless truth that wholeness is not found in the applause of others, but in the union of self and shadow persona and soul. Until then, carry this closing thought with you. The freedom you long for does not come from being valued by all. It comes from valuing yourself enough to choose what honors your being. That is the work of individuation. That is the beginning of peace.